I never imagined I would find myself standing at the edge of suspicion, watching my marriage teetering on the brink. It began subtly, like the first cracks in an otherwise flawless facade. Jenna, my wife, the woman I had shared my life with for years, seemed to be slipping away from me, and I was left in the dark, grasping for answers. At first, I brushed it off as the typical wear and tear of life. After all, we were both busy. She had her job, a demanding role at a marketing firm, and I was busy climbing the corporate ladder myself. But the changes in her behavior became impossible to ignore. She started spending longer hours at the office, often coming home late, claiming she was swamped with projects. The more she worked, the more distant she became, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Her phone had become a barrier between us. I could see her tapping away at it, her brow furrowed in concentration. It was as if her attention was a gift she no longer wanted to share with me. I tried to engage her in conversation, but she would either respond with half-hearted replies or just nod absent-mindedly, her eyes glued to the screen. I felt like a ghost in my own home. Then there were the little things. The once sweet and spontaneous messages she would send me during the day had vanished, replaced by a silence that echoed through our apartment. When she did respond, her texts felt curt, almost rehearsed. I could tell she was putting on a brave face, but the lack of warmth was striking. One evening, after a long day at work, I decided to surprise her. I cooked her favorite dinner, set the table with candles, and waited for her to come home. I imagined how she would smile when she walked in, how we would laugh and catch up on our day. But when she finally arrived, the excitement in the air quickly dissipated. She glanced at the dinner and smiled weakly, her thoughts elsewhere. "Sorry, I'm really tired. Can we just eat and then crash?" she said, her tone devoid of enthusiasm. That night, as we sat across from each other at the dinner table, I felt a heavy weight in my chest. I tried to engage her in conversation about her day, but she seemed uninterested, her mind elsewhere. As I watched her poke at her food, I felt a deep sense of loss for the connection we once had. It was painful to see her so present yet so distant. Days turned into weeks, and my unease grew. I started to notice her clothes, the way she dressed more carefully. She began wearing outfits I hadn't seen before, subtle changes that suggested she was trying to impress someone. It made my heart race with jealousy, a bitter taste in my mouth that I couldn't wash away. I wanted to confront her, but the fear of what I might uncover held me back. I felt trapped in my mind, battling the nagging thoughts that refused to fade. One afternoon, while she was in the shower, I caught a glimpse of her phone on the bedside table. It buzzed with a new message, and for a moment, I contemplated picking it up. I fought against the urge. Trust was the foundation of our marriage, and I didn't want to breach it without cause. But as I stood there, my heart pounding, I couldn't ignore the voice in my head whispering that I needed to know the truth. The following week, I decided to take a day off from work, hoping to catch a glimpse of her routine. I watched her leave the house, dressed sharply, her hair perfectly styled. She kissed me goodbye, a brief peck on the cheek that felt distant as if she were saying goodbye to a stranger. As soon as she left, I felt a knot of anxiety twist in my stomach. Where was she going? Who was she meeting? I tried to distract myself, but every tick of the clock only heightened my worries. I could feel the hours slipping away as I envisioned all the worst-case scenarios. Finally, I decided to drive past her office later that afternoon. I parked a few blocks away and waited, my heart racing as I scanned the street for any sign of her. One evening, I settled into my usual routine, a familiar backdrop of comfort slowly fading into something more sinister. The house was quiet, the only sounds being the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant chirping of crickets outside. I had just returned from work, still buzzing from the day's stresses, when I found Jenna in the living room, her eyes glued to her phone. What caught my attention was not just her focus, but the way a smile crept onto her lips, something that seemed too bright for the moment. I paused in the doorway, my heart thumping in my chest as I watched her. I had grown accustomed to seeing her lost in her phone. But this was different. This smile was warm and genuine, and it sent a jolt of anxiety through me. Who could she be communicating with that would elicit such a reaction? I felt a familiar knot tighten in my stomach. I wanted to confront her, to ask who was on the other end of that screen making her light up like that, but I hesitated. I didn't want to escalate my suspicions into a confrontation without solid proof. What if it was nothing? What if I was just imagining things? Yet, the more I thought about it, the more my insecurities gnawed at me. The boundaries of trust were beginning to blur, and I was teetering on the edge of jealousy. "Hey, what's so funny?" I forced a casual tone, hoping to keep the moment light. She glanced up, her smile faltering for just a second before she returned to her more familiar, muted expression. "Oh, just a funny meme someone sent me," she replied, her voice cheerful but lacking conviction. I nodded, trying to play it cool, but inside I was wrestling with doubts. I wanted to believe her, to cling to the idea that my mind was playing tricks on me. But as the days rolled on, the weight of my suspicions only grew heavier. I began to notice other signs too. The late nights, the subtle changes in her demeanor, and the increased secrecy surrounding her phone. Every little detail piled on, and I felt like I was standing on the precipice of something I couldn't quite grasp. As days passed, I found myself increasingly preoccupied with my thoughts, and it became harder to shake the feeling that I was losing her to someone else. I knew I needed to uncover the truth, but I didn't want to dive headfirst into a confrontation that might lead to more hurt. My desire for proof and clarity became an obsession, consuming my thoughts. Then came the day that changed everything. It was a Saturday morning, and I was enjoying my coffee at the kitchen table while Jenna was in the shower. I heard the familiar sound of her phone vibrating on the counter, and instinctively, I glanced over. It was sitting there, face up, and for a brief moment, I considered leaving it alone. But curiosity surged through me, and I found myself drawn toward it. As I stood up, the decision felt like a slippery slope, but I couldn't help myself. I picked it up and scrolled through her notifications. Nothing out of the ordinary, just the usual barrage of social media alerts and messages from friends. Then, the screen lit up with a series of pictures that made my heart drop. They were photos of Jenna, laughing and embracing a man I didn't recognize. My heart raced as I tried to process what I was seeing. The images flickered by, each one a stab to my chest, showing her with her arms wrapped around him, their faces inches apart, radiant smiles plastered across both their faces. They looked intimate, too comfortable with each other, as if they shared a bond that I was completely unaware of. Panic coursed through my veins. I felt my hands tremble as I fought the urge to hurl the phone across the room. Each photo was like a jigsaw piece clicking into place, confirming all the fears I had pushed to the back of my mind. This was real. This was happening. My heart raced as I tried to maintain my composure. I needed to think clearly, to devise a plan. I couldn't just confront her yet, I had to tread carefully. The last thing I wanted was to explode in anger without having all the facts. This was a situation that required precision and strategy. With a deep breath, I placed her phone back on the counter, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. I felt like a detective in a dark thriller, piecing together clues that would unravel the very fabric of my life. How long had this been going on? Who was this man? As Jenna emerged from the shower, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing in my heart, I resolved to watch and wait. I had a sinking feeling that I was on the verge of a revelation that would change everything. I would gather my evidence, and then I would confront her. Whatever lay ahead, I needed to be ready. In the days following my discovery of the photos, a potent mix of anger and betrayal fueled a fire within me. I felt a chill in my bones, a need for retribution that couldn't be ignored. Confronting Jenna directly felt too reckless, too impulsive. Instead, I needed to plan my next move with precision and cunning. I decided to take a different approach, one that would allow me to reclaim my power without a full-blown confrontation. The man who had invaded my life and my marriage was named Jason. With a little digging, I uncovered that he was a businessman. A suave operator with a promising career and an aura of success. As I learned more about him, my mind began to spin with possibilities. Jason was not just an interloper, he was also a potential target for my revenge. I started my research on him, collecting bits of information like a detective piecing together a case. Social media became my ally, revealing his lifestyle, luxurious vacations, extravagant parties, and a polished public image. But as I dug deeper, I uncovered whispers of controversy surrounding his business dealings. There were murmurs about ethical breaches and questionable practices within his tech startup. With this information, my plan solidified. Instead of confronting Jenna with raw emotion and accusations, I would expose Jason for who he was. If I could orchestrate a scandal that would tarnish his reputation and jeopardize his career, It would not only serve as revenge for the betrayal I felt but also reveal the consequences of Jenna's choices. The more I thought about it, the more the idea thrilled me. I envisioned crafting an anonymous tip that would alert the authorities to Jason's alleged misconduct. I could document everything: his questionable practices, financial irregularities, and whatever evidence I could gather that would support my claims. Each piece of information would serve as a stepping stone toward dismantling his facade. I created a new email account to maintain anonymity and meticulously drafted my message. I detailed everything I had found, weaving together allegations that would be hard to ignore. The act of writing felt empowering. I could sense my control slipping back into my grasp. It was a calculated risk, but one I was willing to take. The decision to seek revenge became my anchor. I felt a surge of adrenaline as I hit send, my heart racing with anticipation of what would unfold next. I imagined the look on Jenna's face when she learned of Jason's downfall and the reality of their relationship began to crumble. My revenge would be a lesson, not just for him but for her as well. As the days went by, I kept a close watch on the situation, relishing in the sense of control I had taken over my life. I had transformed from a passive victim into an active player in this game of betrayal and revenge. And I couldn't wait to see how my plan would unfold, and how it would impact not just Jason but Jenna as well. The stage was set, and soon enough, I would make my move. With my initial plan in motion, I felt a newfound sense of purpose. The thrill of revenge fueled my determination. And I knew I had to be strategic. My connections in the financial sector would be my greatest asset in executing the scheme. I needed to create a web of deception that would ensnare Jason, making it look like he was orchestrating a significant fraud. I reached out to a few contacts, old colleagues and acquaintances who had connections in investment circles. They were familiar with the kind of financial transactions that could raise eyebrows. I casually inquired about any notable patterns or behaviors in tech startups, especially those that had been rumored to engage in dubious practices. I didn't want to draw too much attention to myself, so I played it cool, pretending I was merely curious about industry trends. Through one of my contacts, I learned about a recent spike in interest in Jason's company, especially regarding an upcoming product launch that promised to revolutionize the tech market. This was my opportunity. If I could create a scenario that suggested financial mismanagement or even outright fraud during this critical time, it would heighten the stakes and draw attention to Jason. I decided to leverage my contacts to orchestrate a series of transactions that would appear suspicious. I worked with a friend who was skilled in finance to craft a plan that would show a significant amount of money being funneled out of Jason's company into personal accounts. We mapped out a timeline, creating fake invoices and contracts that would appear legitimate on the surface but would ultimately expose a scheme. Next, I needed to plant the seeds of doubt among Jason's business partners. I reached out to another acquaintance who had dealings with Jason's company and casually brought up rumors I had heard about financial inconsistencies. I mentioned how someone had claimed to have seen questionable transactions and hinted that it was worth keeping an eye on. The idea was to create an environment of suspicion without revealing my true intentions. I could almost feel the excitement coursing through me as I envisioned how everything would unfold. As the scheme took shape, I carefully monitored Jason's activities and interactions. I noticed him becoming increasingly consumed with his upcoming launch, pouring his energy into what he believed would be his crowning achievement. Little did he know, the foundation beneath him was about to crumble. With each passing day, my plan became more intricate. I enlisted the help of a couple of tech-savvy friends to manipulate the digital trails, altering transaction histories and creating fake email chains that would corroborate the fraudulent activities. It was a dangerous game, and I knew the risks involved, but the prospect of seeing Jason's world unravel spurred me on. As the launch date approached, I felt a mix of excitement and apprehension. The moment of truth was near, and I had to remain vigilant. I didn't want Jenna to catch wind of my plans, so I maintained a facade of normalcy around her, acting as if everything was fine. The anticipation of watching Jason's downfall grew unbearable, and I found myself obsessively checking my phone for updates. I knew it was only a matter of time before my carefully laid trap would spring. The culmination of my revenge was within reach, and soon, I would watch as Jason was ensnared in the very web I had woven. The night before the launch, I sat alone in my living room, the glow of the city lights reflecting my thoughts. The adrenaline surged as I considered how far I had come and how quickly everything was about to change. The satisfaction of my impending success mingled with the uncertainty of what it would mean for Jenna and me. But in that moment, all that mattered was the taste of revenge that was so close I could almost savor it. As the days unfolded, I could sense the tension in the air. It was almost palpable, a charged atmosphere that seemed to settle around Jason and his business like a dark cloud. The launch of his highly anticipated product was just around the corner, yet instead of excitement, there was an unmistakable shift in the energy surrounding him. I could hardly contain my satisfaction as I watched from the sidelines. The wheels of my plan finally beginning to turn. Jason had always prided himself on his meticulous attention to detail, but I could see cracks forming in his carefully constructed facade. Whispers of discontent started circulating among his employees. It wasn't long before he began receiving calls from financial institutions, each one more alarming than the last. I watched as he took these calls in his sleek office, his brow furrowed and his expressions growing increasingly strained. One afternoon, I found myself at a nearby cafe, pretending to read a book while I discreetly observed him through the window. I watched as he fidgeted with his phone, pacing back and forth. He was deep in conversation, and even from a distance, I could see that something was weighing heavily on him. I couldn't help but feel a sense of cold satisfaction. My plan was unfolding perfectly. Soon after, I caught wind of the first major blow. Jason's bank accounts had been frozen. It was the kind of news that would send anyone into a tailspin. And I relished the thought of him grappling with the chaos I had set in motion. I imagined the panic coursing through him as he realized that the financial stability he had worked so hard to achieve was slipping through his fingers. Days passed, and the situation only escalated. The tax authorities began their investigations, conducting audits that seemed to scrutinize every transaction within his company. I could hardly contain my glee as I imagined Jason fielding those calls, trying to maintain his composure while the walls closed in around him. I'd seen enough business scandals to know how quickly things could spiral out of control, and I felt an intoxicating rush knowing that I had orchestrated this chaos from the shadows. During the dinner with Jenna, I could see her concern for Jason. She spoke about his stress and how he seemed on edge, but I played the part of the supportive husband, nodding sympathetically while I secretly reveled in the irony of the situation. "He'll figure it out," I said, feigning indifference. Inside, I was celebrating. I was the puppeteer, pulling strings while everyone else was blissfully unaware. As Jason faced mounting pressure, I could see the toll it took on him. He began missing meetings and appearing increasingly frazzled, his trademark confidence replaced by an anxious energy. I often overheard conversations among his colleagues, their hushed tones revealing their growing fears about the future of the company. I could only imagine how isolated he felt, like a ship lost at sea. Unable to navigate the storm brewing around him, I continued to observe him from a distance, savoring each small victory. My plan was working flawlessly, and the realization that I had the power to dismantle his world filled me with a dark sense of satisfaction. Watching him struggle was almost intoxicating. I felt like I was finally taking control of the narrative that had spun out of my hands. But beneath my satisfaction, there was a flicker of unease. I had initiated this cascade of events, and the thought of where it might ultimately lead weighed heavily on my mind. Yet, I quickly pushed those feelings aside. My focus remained on the ultimate goal, to make Jason suffer the consequences of his actions and to show Jenna the reality of her choices. As the days turned into weeks, Jason's situation worsened and the pressure mounted. I couldn't wait to see how far he would fall. The walls were closing in, and I was right there, watching it all unfold with cold, calculating satisfaction. It was only a matter of time before Jenna caught wind of the chaos surrounding Jason, and when she did, the change in her demeanor was immediate and dramatic. One evening, as I sat at the dining table pretending to read a book, I noticed her pacing back and forth, her phone pressed to her ear. I could see the worry etched across her face, a deepening crease in her brow that spoke volumes. "Jason, what do you mean your accounts are frozen?" she exclaimed, her voice trembling. I strained to catch every word. When she finally hung up, she looked pale and shaky. She sank into a chair, her hands trembling as she ran them through her hair. "What am I going to do?" she muttered under her breath, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for answers that weren't there. I watched her, curiosity piqued. There was a flicker of fear in her eyes, and it dawned on me that she might be realizing the extent of her entanglement with Jason. In the days that followed, Jenna's anxiety only intensified. She attempted to reach out to Jason more frequently, but he was becoming increasingly unreachable, caught in a whirlwind of his own making. I could see her desperation grow as she tried to reassure him, promising to help him figure things out. But as the news spread about Jason's troubles, I noticed a shift in her behavior. Then came the news that sent her spiraling into panic. All her accounts were frozen, too. It was as if a dark cloud had descended upon our home, the atmosphere thick with tension and fear. Jenna was distraught, her face pale and eyes wide with disbelief. "How could this happen?" she cried, pacing the living room. "I haven't done anything wrong. This can't be happening." I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and concern as I watched her unravel. The realization that her connection with Jason could expose her indiscretions loomed over her like a storm cloud. She was trapped, caught in a web of her own making, and I couldn't help but feel a rush of exhilaration at how my plan was unfolding. As she scrambled to figure out what to do next, I could see the gears turning in her mind. She began to connect the dots, her suspicions creeping in like shadows. "Do you think this has something to do with Jason?" she asked, her voice trembling as she turned to me, searching for answers. I feigned ignorance, shaking my head with a look of concern. "I don't know, Jenna. It seems strange, doesn't it? But you shouldn't jump to conclusions." Inside, I was reveling in the irony of it all, watching her flounder as the consequences of her choices began to surface. Her world was crumbling, and she was beginning to realize that her relationship with Jason might not stay hidden for long. The mounting pressure and fear were palpable, and I found myself torn between satisfaction at her predicament and an unsettling awareness of the pain it would inevitably cause her. As the days passed, Jenna grew more frantic, trying to reach out to banks and financial institutions, desperate for answers. I watched her, feeling both triumphant and uneasy. I had orchestrated this situation, and now it was all beginning to spiral out of control. The truth about her relationship with Jason was inching closer to the surface, and I wondered how far I was willing to let it go. In the end, I knew that the consequences of my actions would affect us all, but in that moment, all I could feel was the rush of revenge. As Jenna's panic reached new heights, I prepared myself for the fallout, eager to see how this twisted tale would unfold. The unraveling of Jenna's world happened faster than I could have imagined. It began as whispers, small murmurs that echoed through her social circles, but soon transformed into an all-consuming storm. The day it was confirmed that Jenna was entangled with Jason felt like a victory for me, a poetic justice that played out exactly as I had planned. It started with a seemingly innocuous conversation between two of her colleagues at work, their laughter echoing down the hall. But soon, the atmosphere shifted. Glances were exchanged, and conversation ceased when she entered the room. It was only a matter of time before the truth spilled out into the open, and when it did, it came crashing down on her like a freight train. One afternoon, Jenna returned home, her face ashen, her eyes wide with shock. I could tell she had just received the news, and as she collapsed onto the couch, I felt a strange mix of dread and excitement. "Trevor, have you heard what people are saying?" she gasped, clutching her phone like a lifeline. I played the part of the supportive husband, feigning confusion. "No, what's going on?" I asked, keeping my expression neutral, though inside I was reveling in the chaos. "People are saying that I was having an affair with Jason. I can't believe this." Her voice cracked, and I could see the panic rising within her. "I've lost so much already, my accounts, my reputation, now this?" As the days turned into weeks, the fallout was undeniable. Jenna's friends began to distance themselves from her, uncomfortable with the association. Invitations to social gatherings dried up, and I watched as she struggled to maintain her composure. The phone calls and text messages that had once flooded in were replaced by silence, the sound of her isolation echoing through our home. Her colleagues at work were no longer supportive. They whispered behind her back, their faces turning cold when she entered the break room. Jenna had always been well-liked, but now she was the subject of gossip and speculation. I could see the shame wash over her, and it was both heartbreaking and satisfying to witness. Jenna attempted to reach out to those she once considered friends, trying to explain the situation, but her words fell on deaf ears. "You don't understand. I wasn't even with Jason when this all started," she would insist, her voice desperate and strained. Yet, her pleas only deepened their disdain. Each interaction chipped away at her confidence, and the weight of her circumstances grew heavier. As her reputation crumbled, I felt a twisted sense of vindication. The very walls of her life were collapsing, and I was the architect of her downfall. I had orchestrated this fallout, and though a part of me felt a pang of guilt, the overwhelming sense of power I experienced drowned it out. Jenna became a shadow of her former self, retreating into her world, her spirit dampened. I watched as she sank deeper into despair, her once vibrant personality replaced by a haunting emptiness. The realization that her life was spiraling out of control hit her like a ton of bricks. And the pain in her eyes was unmistakable. One evening, as she sat on the couch staring blankly at the television, I decided to confront her about the situation. "Jenna, have you thought about how this might affect your career?" I asked, keeping my tone even. "People talk, they make judgments." She turned to me, tears pooling in her eyes. "I can't believe this is happening to me," she whispered. "I feel so lost, Trevor. I never thought I'd be in this position." My heart twisted at the sight of her anguish. But I quickly masked it with indifference. "You need to take control of your narrative. You can't let this define you," I urged, knowing all too well how deeply her situation was affecting her. But as the reality set in, Jenna understood that her life was unraveling. Her connections, her friendships, and her very identity were slipping through her fingers like sand. The weight of her decisions loomed large, and the repercussions of her affair with Jason had finally come home to roost. As she sat there, defeated and broken, I could feel a mix of triumph and sorrow. I had achieved what I set out to do, but watching her crumble was a bitter pill to swallow. The destruction of her reputation was complete, and I was left to contemplate what would happen next in this twisted saga. What had begun as a desire for revenge had spiraled into something far more complicated, and I knew that the end was still far from sight. The day Jason was arrested marked a turning point in this chaotic saga, a culmination of the carefully laid traps I had set in motion. I had watched his downward spiral with a mix of satisfaction and unease, but nothing could prepare me for the spectacle of his arrest. News of the event rippled through our small community, a shocking headline that seemed to overshadow everything else. It was a gray morning when the police arrived at his office. I caught wind of the news through a text from one of Jenna's few remaining friends, who still clung to her for support despite the backlash. "Did you see? Jason was taken away in handcuffs." The words hit me like a bolt of lightning, but I quickly masked my reaction, pretending to be surprised. I imagined Jason's disbelief as the officers read him his rights, the gravity of the situation sinking in. He had built his life on the foundation of success and trust, but at that moment, everything crumbled around him. I could see him protesting, insisting that he was innocent, trying to comprehend how everything had gone so wrong. But the evidence against him was overwhelming, a perfect storm of manipulated transactions and fabricated documentation that I had orchestrated. Days turned into weeks, and the trial quickly became the talk of the town. I followed the news closely, reveling in the details as they unfolded. Jason's lawyer argued fervently for his innocence, claiming that he had been set up, but the prosecution painted a different picture. They presented documents that painted him as the mastermind of a massive financial fraud scheme, with fabricated invoices and false transactions that seemingly pointed directly at him. As the trial progressed, it became evident that Jason's plea of innocence fell on deaf ears. The judge and jury were swayed by the evidence, and I felt a pang of regret as I watched him struggle. I had set the stage, but now I was witnessing the fallout of my actions play out in real time. There were moments when he would look into the camera, a haunted expression in his eyes as if he were silently begging for someone to believe him. It was a chilling reminder of how easily lives could be dismantled. Eventually, the verdict came in, guilty on multiple counts of financial fraud. I felt a rush of exhilaration at his downfall, yet it was overshadowed by an unsettling sense of reality. Jason was sentenced to several years in prison, and I imagined the emptiness of his life behind bars, lost dreams, broken friendships, and a future that would never be the same. Meanwhile, Jenna was left to grapple with the fallout. Alone and isolated, she had lost not only her reputation but also her support system. Friends had abandoned her, colleagues no longer wanted to associate with her, and now Jason's arrest sealed her fate. She had become a pariah, a casualty of a relationship that had spiraled out of control. As I watched Jenna navigate this new reality, I felt a complex mix of emotions. I had achieved my revenge, but at what cost? She was living in a world filled with shame and regret, devoid of the life she had once known. Every time I saw her, the pain in her eyes served as a constant reminder of the devastation I had caused. One evening, as she sat on the couch staring blankly at the wall, I saw the remnants of the woman she used to be, a vibrant, confident person now reduced to a shell of her former self. She had been left with nothing, no money, no friends, and no hope. I wanted to reach out to her, to show some semblance of compassion, but the bitterness of what had transpired held me back. The repercussions of my actions had come full circle, and as I sat in silence beside her, I understood that while I had succeeded in my quest for revenge, the price had been far greater than I had anticipated. Jason was imprisoned, Jenna was alone, and I was left with the haunting realization that I had orchestrated this chaos, a puppet master in a tragic play of betrayal and loss. As the final curtain fell on this chapter of our lives, I was left to ponder the choices that had led us here. The bitterness of revenge had tasted sweet, but the aftermath was anything but satisfying. With Jason behind bars and Jenna adrift in a world stripped of its former glory, I couldn't shake the feeling that the true consequences of my actions were yet to unfold. As I watched Jenna's life continue to unravel, I felt a sense of satisfaction wash over me. My plan had come to fruition. Jason was behind bars, and the fallout from our twisted love triangle had left her isolated and vulnerable. It was a strange blend of triumph and sorrow, and the reality of it weighed heavily on my conscience. One afternoon, as I sat across from her in the dim light of our living room, I could see the toll that the past few months had taken on her. Her once bright eyes were now dull and weary, framed by dark circles that spoke of sleepless nights and endless worry. She was a mere shadow of the woman I had once known, and while I felt a perverse pleasure in her suffering, I couldn't help but recognize the heavy price of my revenge. "Jenna," I began, my voice steady but tinged with an emotion I couldn't quite place. "You deserve to know the truth about what happened." Her gaze flickered up to meet mine, a mix of curiosity and fear evident in her expression. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I leaned forward, the weight of my revelation pressing down on me like a lead blanket. "It was me, Jenna. I orchestrated everything. I set Jason up and made sure he would be arrested for the fraud he didn't commit. It was all planned. I wanted you to see the consequences of your actions." Her face fell, and I could see the realization dawning on her. The betrayal cut deeper than I had anticipated. "You did this?" she gasped, her voice breaking. "You destroyed his life? You destroyed mine? Don't you understand?" I continued, trying to keep my emotions in check. "You were so lost in your affair that I had to show you the truth. I had to make you feel the pain that you caused." As the words left my lips, I felt a rush of triumph, but it quickly morphed into something darker, a creeping sense of regret. The satisfaction of revenge was now tainted with the awareness that my actions had irrevocably altered our lives. The price of this vendetta had come at a cost I had never fully grasped. Jenna stared at me, her eyes wide with disbelief and pain. "And what did you gain from this, Trevor? You've ruined everything. Do you think this makes you a hero? You're just as much a part of this mess as I am." Her words struck me like a slap in the face. The truth was undeniable. I had lost just as much as she had. The life we once shared, the trust we had built, it was all gone. Revenge had consumed me, blinding me to the fact that I was also a casualty of this twisted game. "I thought I could teach you a lesson," I admitted, my voice faltering. "But now I see that all I've done is tear us apart. I didn't just hurt Jason, I hurt you, too. I've destroyed everything we had." Jenna looked away, tears streaming down her cheeks. "It's too late for that now, isn't it? We can't go back. I don't even know who you are anymore." Her words hung in the air, a bitter reminder of the chasm that had opened between us. I realized that while I had reveled in my victory, I had also sacrificed the last remnants of our relationship. The past we shared was now irretrievable, swallowed by the darkness of my revenge. At that moment, I felt a crushing weight of loneliness and loss. The satisfaction I had craved was overshadowed by the emptiness that enveloped me. I had set out to destroy her world, but in the process, I had dismantled my own. As I sat there, the silence between us thick and suffocating, I understood that revenge had not brought me the fulfillment I had hoped for. Instead, it had left me with a hollow victory and a painful truth. I, too, had lost everything. The irony was almost unbearable. My quest for retribution had cost me my dignity, my love, and any hope for a future together. I watched as Jenna crumbled under the weight of her despair, and a part of me longed to reach out and comfort her. But the damage was done, and the path we had taken had forever changed the course of our lives. In seeking revenge, I had lost sight of the love we once shared, and now all that remained was a desolate reminder of what could have been.